Okay, I need to talk about what is happening in Nigeria, right? So, in case some of you don't know, Nigeria is a big West African country, most populous on the continent, rich in natural resources, especially petroleum and natural gas. And despite this wealth, the international and domestic capital, those forces have heavily exploited Nigeria. Over half of the population is considered multidimensionally poor. Nigeria, as we know it, was formed by the British when they joined the northern and southern protectorates of Nigeria. They gained their independence in 1960 and became a republic in 1963. But that colonial north-south divide still shapes politics in Nigeria today. The south is predominantly Christian and north is predominantly Muslim. Tragically, Nigeria has had a long history of political and religious violence, including the 1987 crisis in Kaduna State and the early 2000s violence, such as the Yelwa massacre and the Jos riots. And since 2009, Boko Haram has led a prolonged insurgency against the Nigerian state, with methods including bombings, assassinations, and mass abductions, and their victims including Christians, Muslims, and basically anyone who's opposed to their goals. Now, in recent months, Western media attention has increased its focus on Nigeria thanks to Donald Trump. There's been a narrative growing of Christian genocide in Nigeria that has been promoted by the US far-right and pro-Israel commentators. People who deny the Palestinian genocide and promote the white genocide myth of South Africa are claiming there's a Christian genocide happening in Nigeria. And so this particular narrative gained a lot of momentum actually after the Nigerian vice president made a speech at the UN General Assembly in September last year, where they reaffirmed solidarity with Palestine, and clearly Washington did not like that. Other public figures have also been amplifying this Christian genocide narrative. You have Bill Maher, I don't know how you say his last name. But he was saying that the violence in Nigeria was more of a genocide than Gaza. And then we have the perennial clown Nicki Minaj, who Trinidadians do not claim, by the way, publicly supporting Trump's persecution, framing of the Christians in Nigeria. And so then in late October, early November 2025, Trump tweeted out that Christianity is facing an existential threat in Nigeria, that Nigeria is a country of particular concern, and that US was ready, willing, and able to save Christians globally. In November 2025, Trump said the US would send troops into Nigeria, guns ablazing. And in December 2025, the US launched airstrikes on Christmas Day against militants linked to the Islamic State in northwestern Nigeria, which crucially does not target Boko Haram, which is based in northeastern Nigeria. These strikes also occurred following the efforts of Burkina Faso, Niger, and Mali to form a joint 5,000 strong counterterrorism force, which in turn followed ECOWAS's plans to establish a 260,000 strong counterterrorism force in the region. And so then in January 2026, Trump said that he wanted a one-time strike, but he would warn of repeated strikes if Christians continued to be killed. And Trump has repeatedly accused the Nigerian government of failing to protect Christians. Trump lies like he breathes. All right, so we got to take everything he says about what's going on in the world with a grain of salt. When you look at what's actually happening on the ground in Nigeria, I think it paints a very different picture. Religion is one factor among many for violence in the country, unfortunately, but there are other factors to take into consideration as well. There are criminal motivations like ransom or land control, there are economic pressures, and there are political struggles that these fighters may be engaged in. Their targets are not exclusively Christian. Many of them target Muslims. Many of the people who Boko Haram or the Islamic State of West African province targets are Muslims. And Boko Haram and the Islamic State affiliated groups are not the only groups engaging in violence. There's also the armed banditry in Nigeria. There's also the Fulani herdsmen involved in herder-farmer conflicts, which have been taking place in the country for centuries, but have only become deadlier as of late thanks to the widespread availability of AK-47s and other firearms, which is in turn thanks to American intervention in Libya. Again, the beast strikes again. So Western focus has disproportionately been highlighting the attacks on churches and Christian leaders, and not really as much talking about the Muslims and animists and other victims who have been targeted, and basically simplifying the violence in the region to just anti-Christianity. But the thing is, the priests and church targetings even are not necessarily religiously motivated. In some cases, the priests are targeted because they're seen as worthy of, procuring high ransoms. And this is according to the Archbishop in Nigeria. Right? However, as he does does point out there are structural forms of religious discrimination happening in Nigeria, in northern Nigeria in particular. Since 1999, Sharia law was implemented in 12 of the northern states, and that has made it very difficult to obtain permits to build churches and difficult for Christians to exercise their freedom of religion in northern Nigeria. And of course, can't deny there are cases where Christians face forced conversions, where they're attacked during worship services, where their villages are razed, where their identity is weaponized during attacks. And so there is a religious trauma that I think should be acknowledged, a trauma that the Christian community in Nigeria is dealing with, but I don't think that it should be boiled down to that simplistic genocide framing used by Western actors. Not every form of mass violence is genocide. You know what I mean? Not every mass killing is a genocide by default. And so I don't think Trump is particularly humanitarian in his interests. I don't think he cares about Christians or Christianity that much, except to the extent that it feeds into his own ego and power. I think the US is seeking to gain greater control over rare earth minerals and other resources, particularly considering the position China has been in. China has been setting up for itself in Africa. I mean, Chinese companies have invested over 1.3 billion US dollars in Nigeria's lithium processing, and even Russia is expanding its influence in the region via Niger, Burkina Faso, and Mali. And so Trump is kind of trying to scramble for Africa right now, you know? He doesn't like the fact that Nigeria's president is not playing ball with him in all the ways he would like. Nigeria did not do enough in Trump's eyes to reverse Niger's military coup. Nigeria did not accept the US's request to relocate the base that they had in Niger into Nigeria. Nigeria did not accept US deportees, unlike several other African countries like Eswatini. And Nigeria continues to condemn Israel's actions in Gaza. So that's like a quadruple homicide as far as the US is concerned. Like, why aren't you bowing down? You know? And so the US don't necessarily need humanitarian justifications to intervene in countries. When they intervene in Guatemala, that was just like pure profit interest, profit motive. You know, they intervene in Congo in 1961, intervene in Iran in 1953, in Chile in 1973. It's not about humanitarian concerns for them. And the outcomes of the interventions are never humanitarian. You know, in Iraq and Libya and Syria and Afghanistan and in Somalia, the outcome has been dire. And so really we can expect that any US intervention in Nigeria is most likely going to fail and just create more victims. And so the US has recently announced that it's deploying a military team of 200 troops in Nigeria. It remains to be seen what happens next. I think it should be clear that these counter-terrorism quote-unquote approaches mainly exist to expand militarization, surveillance, repression, and imperialist power. State power, whether it is domestic or foreign state power, is never going to be neutral in these situations. It's never going to be a reliable solution to the violence these spaces are facing. As the state continues to reproduce the colonial divisions that are creating these problems, as militarization, I think, deepens the violence related to these problems, I think it's up to the people on the ground in Nigeria to lead their own solutions, to not have to deal with American intervention, and not have to deal with their own government's meddling and suppression, and not have to deal with these warlords and terrorist forces. I don't really like to use the word terrorism, but I'll just say it here. These terrorist forces that are terrorizing them in more ways than one. As always, networks of solidarity, localized self-defense systems, and community self-organization across religious and ethnic lines are going to be the steps I think Nigerians will need to take to liberate themselves, not just from, you know, these militants or their own government's repression or external governments like the US intervention, but to carve out a Nigeria for themselves that is not in the clutches of local, regional, and international violence and exploitation. The left and progressive elements in Nigeria were significantly weakened after 1999, but they have been making a resurgence as of late. They started to build back up their forces during the EndSARS movement in 2020, and there were further signs of resurgence in 2024 with the End Bad Governance movement and with the launch of groups like Take It Back and the work of the Socialist Workers League. They've been developing more coherent demands and engaging in increasing mobilization, which is powerful and necessary. They faced repression, they faced arrests, they faced a lot in their efforts to declare their goals and to exercise the agency. But I think the next step for the progressive forces in Nigeria, the liberatory forces in Nigeria, the grassroots forces, is to turn that renewed mobilization to something lasting. into durable organizations that can not only develop an alternative but also fight back against the state and against all the forces of repression in Nigeria and in the region. That is my recommendation to people all over the world, to develop those organizations, to wield your labor and your capacity as workers, as neighbors, as community members, as students, to put your vision into reality, to block their efforts to extract from you, from your time, from your energy, from your labor, and to go forth and build something new. All power to all the people. Peace.